So one of the things that's going on right now, of course, is the election, and we're gearing up for that. And we don't shy too far from politics on this show. We talk about it. We try to put it maybe in a more complicated or more complex framework than the media necessarily does. And
what election?
Try not
what are you talking about?
to be too simplistic. Well, I was just pointing out to our guest here, and I thought about this quite a lot, was that November 5th is also Guy Fawkes Day. So I really don't know if that was like a coincidence or not. Thought that was
nothing's a coincidence in the synchromistic universe.
Divinely ordained.
Remember the 5th of November.
Yeah.
So John Brooks is joining us from Pod Only Knows podcast. And just recently, he was talking about Project 2025 on his show. And we're going to talk about that tonight and some other things dealing with the election. Also, one of the things that John talks a lot about on there is a lot about Christian nationalism. If you don't know, Pod Only Knows, I think it's the third time you've been on.
Yeah.
But if people aren't familiar with it, please tell people about the podcast and what you talk about and how it's pertinent to what we're going to be talking about.
Sure. Well, great to be back. First of all, good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
Pod Only Knows, me and my co-host Kelly Baker. We are both non-religious religion scholars. We are both cusp Generation X millennials. I was born in 79. She was born in 80. We're like exactly a year apart from each other. So we come from a very like similar perspective, although she was raised in the South, I was raised in the North. So we have this like kind of, two different perspectives on kind of American religious landscape, from the academic kind of scholarly lens, and we're both very kind of snarky and like to swear a lot. So it's a show for people interested in religion who are not themselves religious, or maybe they are. We certainly have listeners who are religious, but we talk about the intersection of religion and culture, and sort of popular belief and that sort of thing. We just did an episode about Stockholm Syndrome, which because that term had come up sort of in the discussions of Jewish Democrats and a bunch of other things. So, I think that's one of those kind of interesting places where, religion and sort of popular understandings of things and misunderstandings of things are they maybe meet that sweet spot. So that's the kind of stuff that we like to talk about. Where our next episode is about the movie Jesus Camp, which we've been planning for a long time. Great 2006 documentary, which overlaps with a bunch of stuff that we can talk about today as well. We like to be sort of varied. We have guests and scholars on sometimes, and sometimes it's just us. But it's a good time, and you don't have to have any kind of religious background or belief or whatever to listen to it. So that's our show.
Since you brought up Jesus Camp.
Yeah.
I don't think I actually saw that until probably like maybe 10 years after it was out.
Yeah.
But thinking about that movie and that documentary, I wonder if the culture that it depicts in that has something to do with where we are now, with what we're currently going through in this country. It could be a very kind of like frightening documentary, but I don't think they necessarily made it in that way as like a propaganda piece. I think it was just more like, displaying this is the culture that these people, this kind of like church culture. And some people get out of it and some people don't, but people that are still in it are very much obviously still around.
It's interesting because the three kids so it was made in 2006, and so they're all in sort of their mid-20s now, and the three kids who are heavily featured, Levi, who's the boy with the rat tail, is still a devout Christian, still basically believes all the same stuff. He is married, he's got like 3 kids. I'm trying to remember her name. So Tori, the dancer, is still sort of like, we don't really know tons about her Christianity, but she went to like a mainstream university, that sort of thing. She still dances. And then the one who's most interesting, Rachel, she's the one who's very sort of nerdy, right? Like keeps approaching strangers to talk to them about Jesus. And last, like we heard about her in public, she's kind of talked about like how she sort of lapsed in her Christianity, and then she had this like conversation with God where God was like, "Stop taking it so seriously and like have more fun in life." So she's decided to have like a much more kind of like lovey, fun relationship with God, but like still a believer. So, the idea that these are like the three that we, if you've got sort of the preachers who are sort of indoctrinating these kids, being like, "You are the future generation who will like bring in, the new Christian nationalist utopia." With these three kids, especially, like didn't happen, right? That's not how it wound out, and it's a pretty typical, I think, if you take any three sort of ultra evangelical kids from like 2006 and ask where they are now, like that's basically where they usually wind up, right? Although you probably have more who are like, "Yeah, I've left entirely. I'm an ex-evangelical, everything else." But no, one of the things that really is interesting rewatching it is the way that it overlapped with the ascension of Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court, and I think there's a story there from the excitement and enthusiasm that Alito is going to lead to the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which is like one of the things they talk about in the documentary. And here we are living in the future, and I like there's a lot to mine as far as that goes, but. Yeah, the story of like 2006 George W. Bush era American evangelicalism to like 2024 Trump era American evangelicalism is a really, really interesting one. And I think like that's a good place to kind of start and look at the contrasts between then and now.
Isn't Ted Haggard, doesn't he show up in that?
He is, yes. And the Ted Haggard of it all, of course, is like a really big element of it. If you guys are old enough to remember Ted Haggard was everywhere during the Bush administration. He was one of the major sort of political evangelical celebrities until the whole thing of him doing meth with male prostitutes became well known. And
that little thing, yeah.
Still kicking around, still like married to his wife, like, he's still doing it, but he was a massive, massive figure in evangelical Christianity, and has since been replaced by other folks. You could argue like Trump is the main figure in evangelical Christianity today, in a
I think that recent history and then the history that connects that time in the early aughts to, of course, like the 80s and the moral majority stuff is really important. And to be honest, the left and I guess just secular political forces in general are known for a lot of times having like bad messaging. And to be honest, when the word Christian nationalism first started to be used like recently, I was struck that it was presented almost as this novelty, and it didn't seem to be like connected. Like we can draw a through line, like where this stuff came from. A lot of this that's happening now is a result of, at least 50 years plus of like planning of people basically wanting a theocracy, and like planning detailed how they're going to accomplish that. And like when people start using this new buzzword, which I think does encapsulate what it is, but it felt like it was disconnected from putting it into that recent historical perspective and, further out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's like and I guess this is a good like transition point to talk about Project 2025, because when we did our episode on it, my argument is less like there's been a lot of coverage of like, there's this document, and if Trump becomes president, this is all going to happen, and here's what it says. And it's like, no, it's really important. I'm really glad finally for the last like month or so, this thing that's just been sitting there is finally catching on. But one of the things that I think is, to your point, Surveil, is that like, this is not like out of nowhere. And the 50-year story of the Heritage Foundation and Paul Weyrich, right? Like this is a direct line from that story. It is a battle in this like ongoing war that they have been waging since the 1970s, and it's funny that you mentioned moral majority because, of course, Paul Weyrich is the person who coined that term. And Paul Weyrich is one of the three co-founders of the Heritage Foundation, right? Who produced this hellscape 900-page George R. Martin novel of a dystopian future. So
Well,
yeah, I agree. I think the history, the connective history of it is really important and shouldn't be overlooked in just in favor of like what's actually in the document.
yeah, so let's talk about Project 2025. And I guess we really should lay the groundwork with the organization that put it out, the
Hmm.
Heritage Foundation. And also to add to Sergio's point, I mean, the media really picked up on this, of course, with the election, with Project 2025, but like, in the last few months, but I've known about it since 2022. Like
Hmm.
it's been on my radar primarily because of like our good friend Dr. Bennett, Dr. Future,
Hmm.
who I'm sure you've heard on the show. I mean,
Hmm.
he's known about it forever too. So I mean, it's like this is definitely not a new thing. It's been around for 2 years. It's been
Hmm.
out there to read, but let's lay the groundwork of what the Heritage Foundation is, what it does, and how it has made this document.
Sure. Well, so the Heritage Foundation is a think tank, and the definition of a think tank, as Kelly and I talked about on the show, is sort of in the eye of the beholder in some ways. It's sort of a nebulous defined thing, but essentially a think tank is like a external to government organization of people who have a policy agenda and craft policies that can be presented to lawmakers in order to create legislation, right? That's basically what it comes down to. So they kind of outsourcing a lot of the work of government in a way that like can be positive, right? So like the initial like what's considered to be the first think tank is the Brookings Institute, and that goes back to the early 20th century. And Brookings is kind of a centrist, slightly left of center, especially on like national security issues and domestic, like social issues. Maybe a little bit more center right when it comes to like, uh, you know, taxing issues and that sort of thing. But like, the whole idea was basically like to make government more effective by creating like a bunch of intellectuals getting together and creating smart legislation that people who write the laws can be like, okay, this saves me a lot of time, right? And there's something to be said for that, right? There's something about like innovation and efficiency to be said for that concept. um in 1972, Paul Weyrich, who at that time had already been working in government, became frustrated that basically the whole kind of think tank infrastructure had been dominated by what he considered to be the left. And as hilarious as it is to say now, the left had this reputation of being very, very good and like getting its way and organizing, which is like an insane thing to think in 2024. Less so recently. We've actually like gotten our act together a little bit, but certainly for a long time, like the left is very good at fighting itself, kind of since then. But he sort of looked at the way that the left in America sort of was like ruthless in the way that it like got legislation across. Of course, there's a lot of advances in civil rights and that sort of thing in the 1960s, which is probably sort of what he's thinking about when he's doing this. So in 1972, he creates the Heritage Foundation, largely with the money of the grandson of Adolf Coors, of beer fame, Joseph
Yes.
Coors.
Hmm.
Uh, Adolf, of course, no longer a popular name in American society, but he was before the other one. And then Edwin Fulner, who also was the president for a while. So the three of them got together. And what's interesting about sort of uh, the kind of dynamic of the Heritage Foundation is that it really, and this is what Paul Weyrich was kind of a genius at, was marrying the sort of Christian nationalist social agenda to the sort of right-wing economic kind of libertarian free market economics agenda. Follner was much more of kind of a, market economics guy, right? Like much more concerned, less concerned with like, prayer in school and that kind of thing, and like abortion, and more concerned with like cutting taxes for the ultra wealthy, right? So like a very kind of traditional, like far right conservative, sort of policy guy, but like much less the sort of like, far right, Christian nationalist sort of guy. Weyrich was definitely of the social conservative sort of Christian nationalist mold, but he also understood that in order to sell that agenda, you had to sort of couch it within kind of traditional conservatism. So one of the things that Weyrich was kind of an evil genius at was realizing that ultimately, like saying things like gay agenda, right? Saying things like, being openly anti-Semitic, right? That sort of thing. Being openly misogynistic. Like it's a loser, right? It's a loser in popular elections. Like it doesn't play. And so, what Weyrich was able to do was kind of make this, for instance, like he was kind of the mastermind behind the strategy of the opposition to LGBTQ rights and the so-called gay agenda, shifting it away from being gay is evil, which he also said and believed, right? He's like, my biblical understanding says this, but, right, the reason why I oppose it is this. And so he would always couch it in this idea of it's a threat to the traditional family, and the traditional family of like 2 parents and 3.5 children or whatever it is, right, is essential to the American economy, right? And so it's not so much that being gay is bad and that's why we should have legislation against it. It's that being, having a same-sex partnership does not promote the sort of like economically robust engine that the sort of, Christian conservative nuclear family does. And so he would always sort of make those kinds of arguments. And I think it's really interesting that like when you look at, fast forward 50 years later, when you look at J.D. Vance, like he keeps making this exact argument, right? He's like making this Christian nationalist argument, but from the perspective of like, I want there to be strong families and we need to make sure that we're like reproducing so that Social Security doesn't die. It's all just sort of, but it's all sort of part of the Weyrich playbook. And so Weyrich was like deeply anti-democratic, right? Like but he was able to like sell this idea of this anti-democracy, far-right Christian nationalism in these like economic terms. And that's one of the reasons why when, a lot of people today are like, well, I'm socially liberal, but like fiscally conservative, it's like, that doesn't work because those things have been entirely tied together. And part of that has to do with the Heritage Foundation and its projects.
What was the statement that he made? He made some kind of statement at one point where he had said something about voting.
Yeah. So it's a pretty famous, like, getting caught saying the quiet part out loud moment, where, he said the thing that has been true. I mean, I think it's less true now, but it's been a truism of sort of conservative politics for the last 50 or so years that conservatives lose when there's big turnout. Right? Like conservatives lose when more people vote. There are more people in this country who are aligned with, left of center politics, that if you have a massive turnout election, Democrats win them all the time. And, he said very openly, right, that what the Democrats want is everybody to vote. And he said, I don't want everybody to vote. And in fact, our leverage in election goes down the more people vote, right? And, this was prior to the kind of conspiracy theory that the right has put forward for the last 20 or so years, kind of gradually, of election fraud, of election theft, of immigrants coming into the country being granted citizenship quickly and then I guess being forced to vote for Democrats. I don't really understand how that works exactly, right? But it's all kind of part of this, like, well, we can't explicitly say that we don't want people to vote yet, right? Like, we're not there yet. The Overton window hasn't shifted that far. But we can, like, make it clear that, like, look, when people vote, we lose. So, we should think of ways of minimalizing that outcome so that we win more often. Yeah, it's weird because he was never like he was never he was never shying away from what he really believed. Right? Like he would never, in interviews in public, he would never not say the thing that was the quiet part. But in his strategizing, especially with heritage, right? It was like figuring out how to crack away at the mainstream, and then eventually, you will get to you will weaken the system enough that you'll be able to then implement all of these far-right Christian nationalist policies. And I think basically Heritage right now, under its current leadership, has decided this is the moment to strike. This is the thing we've been leading up to all this time. A lot of conservatives will say that Heritage has been basically a kind of a centrist or like center-right sort of squishy organization for a long time. And certainly it's kind of played that role, right, sort of outwardly, but it's always been working with the most extreme members of the far right to like figure out ways to normalize the far right agenda. And Project 2025 is really kind of the moment where they're like, it's now or never, right? Like, we're not going to get a better opportunity than this to impose Christian nationalism on America. So we're just going to come out with it and say it and like put it out there and, let the chips fall where they may.
Well, that kind of anti-democratic sentiment, I think, makes sense with why now would be the time to almost, come out with something as open as Project 2025, because that world is increasingly speaking in existential terms that demographically democracy is not going to work for their version of free markets, for their version of society and white supremacy and things like that. So like now it's becoming another conversation, and they get to like put it in the trappings of that whole we're a republic, not a democracy kind of language.
Yes.
And things like that can appeal to some people who are secular. And you see how the messaging is received differently by different groups. Like, being from the South, me and Adam, have a different perspective, but like I have West Coast, mostly secular Republican family who really, take the messaging in a different way. And it really seems like this stuff is coming to a head.
I'm glad you brought up the republic, not a democracy thing. So one of the things that is sort of evidence of the way that this has been a plan in motion for some time is that a lot of the stuff that becomes kind of like conspiracy theories within the far right that then become just like Republican policy, right? And if you look at the way that sort of these ideas of voter fraud, going back to like John McCain saying that Acorn, which was like a community organizing
that's group, a throwback. I haven't heard that.
Was going to steal the 2008 election, right? And then to like obviously 2020, 12 years later, and like you can draw a straight line there. I was very alarmed in trying to get people to pay attention about 5 or 6 years ago when the right and largely sort of poked by a lot of these think tanks started pushing their elected officials and sort of mouthpieces on television to use that term that America is a republic and not a democracy. Which again, that's a long conversation that we can have. It is fundamentally not true, right? Like it's true if you ignore all of history, I suppose, right? But It's obviously very clearly an anti-democratic trial balloon. It's a way of kind of normalizing this mantra among the right to say like, oh no, we actually are anti-democratic because America was never supposed to be a democracy. And like,
Yeah.
also any analyst will tell you that it's actually not a democracy, but like we should be and should be working to be one and be better at being one, right? Those two things can be true at the same time. But yeah, like that sort of normalizing of this idea on the far right and then the mainstream right that no, in fact, we're not democratic. We don't believe in democracy. And we're only a few years away from that just being basically a Republican article of faith. I'm quite sure of it, right? Like, I don't think it's going to be long before most Republicans are like, yes, we don't believe in democracy. That is not the founding principle of this country. It's a republic. And again, you have J.D. Vance, now saying things like women shouldn't vote, right? Like, because that's, and if you don't have kids, why should you be voting? Why, like, these things are being troubled in the last
If
couple
you're
of
not
years.
a real American, then
Wider, yeah.
Where you have no stake in the future. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine the kind of empathy you have to lack to not to think that like if you don't have children, you have no stake in the future. It's mind blowing, but like that's what they're trying to do, right? That's what they're trying to sell.
So I have heard this for several years. I've heard this whole, we're a democracy, not a we're a
Other way
republic,
around.
not a democracy.
Yeah.
I used to hear Phil Valentine say that, a lot, a
Yeah.
lot. And I've heard several other people on the right side. My response to that is that if you look at the history of republics, the idea of a dictatorship fits into the history of republics.
Sure. Absolutely.
It's like almost built in.
Yeah.
So it's like this is it's really just a semantic game
yeah.
of saying that like you could be the French Revolution and Napoleon. I mean, Napoleon serves as the first consul. Well, technically, it was still the Republic, even though he was a
Right.
dictator.
Yeah.
I mean, it still fits into that. You're right in that is like it's this really kind of perverse code
Mhm.
for having something like that.
And they want to it means they want to either stop or reverse enfranchisement is really what it means.
Yeah, and it's a rhetorical permission structure, right? I think that's what you're getting at, Adam, is that, it's a way of saying like, well, if if we're just going to go back to being a dictatorship, what makes America any different than a monarchy, the monarchy that we famously broke away from in that war that you're all so proud of. And it's like, oh no, you can be a dictatorship and a republic at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And we could get into the whole like the whole office of the dictator in the Roman Republic, which is a real thing, right? Like, yeah, you can get all semantic about it, but there's absolutely a way of rhetorically crafting the idea that you still live in an American republic with a dictator at the top of it, because that's what we need now, or else nothing's going to get done, and democracy is too slow and inconvenient to meet our needs. And yeah, sure. I mean, that's sort of always how the modern dictators have come to power, right? It's not the embrace of like a divine right kingship, right? That's not what Stalin was saying. It's not what Hitler was saying, right? It is through the means of so-called Republican government. And I think if you just look at like Hungary, right, I think that's your model, right?
Yeah. And with populism, they can present themselves as being even more democratic,
Right.
They're fighting against an entrenched oligarchy,
because the lying media
the dictator
is stopping you from, right. You got to arrest journalists, because otherwise you'll be lied to and won't be able to make informed decisions, because that's why they
Really, when the United States started as a republic, we weren't really a democracy. There was democratic elements. I mean, it was originally set up to where the legislature, and that meaning the House of Representatives, was the one that was directly voted in by the people.
Yep.
The Senate was appointed by the states.
Correct.
And then you had the Electoral College, and that could be chosen by any means at that time. It wasn't until the time of Jacksonian democracy that you begin to see much more popular. But, at first, the only people that could vote were, the landed gentry, essentially. So it's like almost like that's what this group, in a sense, really kind of wants to get back to, is an elite that controls the rest, essentially.
Yeah, I suppose that's the great again part of making
Yeah.
America great again is going back to that. No, you're absolutely right, and they have an argument to be made there, right? It's not a fantasy to go back to this idea of like only landed, white males should be able to vote because that's originalism. And they also have an argument to be made that much of American governance is not democratic. I mean, the Supreme Court's not democratic. The fact that like Wyoming has as many senators as California, which has 10% of the population of the US, right? Like where like Los Angeles County alone like has more people than like 40% of the land mass of the United States, and yet they have the same number of senators, right? That's not democratic. The Electoral College is not democratic. Like, no, these things are not democratic. We should fix them and make them more democratic and not be like, no, that's good. Let's go back to because if Thomas Jefferson knew about California, he'd be like, I'm sorry, how many people, right? Like, how many millions of people live in what? How big is this fucking country now? So it's a matter of like, do you think of history as static or do you think of it as something that we became a democracy and have moved more and more towards democracy because of the tides of history? And that is what America is now, right? Like that's what the suffragette movement was. Like these things are historical moments that got written into the Constitution and are now part of what America is, right? It's part of that sort of like moving history. We're not what we were, right, in the 1780s. It's absurd to think so.
Yeah. We have a constitution that is not static.
Right.
That is a living document and
by
that
design.
can be amended and by design and can be changed. And also there's other rights that are inherent in the people to where the electorate can steadily increase over time.
Yeah.
But the thing that has been relatively static has been secularism and the separation of church and state, which is recently really what we're focusing on in this show, is that more than anything is a thing that is under threat by these people who are trying to create a big tent, but it's really not. The appeal that they're using with these other, philosophical appeals and stuff like what we were just talking about, it's a lot more specific than that. And if this country is anything, as far as the early ideals, it was that, separation of church and state and a place for the freedom of religion, which is really under siege.
Yeah. This is such a complicated thing as well, because the separation of church and state was a concept championed, right? I mean, the Establishment Clause was championed by Protestant Christians, right? Mm-hmm. It was an idea where like, and it is like, we need to be honest and say that like the framers really thought that the First Amendment granted you to be any kind of Christian you want to be, right? Like, and there's some stuff in Jefferson where he makes it clear that like Muslims are counted too, but for the most part, people envisioned that America would be a nation of like different kinds of Christians and also like none of the aboves, and that's pretty much it, because like they couldn't have envisioned Ellis Island, right? In the 1780s. So it's a complicated question as to like the religiosity, the Establishment Clause, the wall between church and state, and because we have all these different kind of founding documents, some of which are canonical and some of which are not, right? It is a tricky question. But I do think what's worth noting is that, fundamentally, no, this was not founded as a Christian nation. It is very clear, right? Jefferson used the term creator and not God in the Declaration of Independence. That is very specific general language to like avoid using any specific God, any specific religious terminology. There is a lot of forensic evidence to say that like it is the design of this country to not have a test of religion, to not have any requirements for being religious, to be free both from religion as well as have freedom of religion. Having said that, there are people from the of the framers who disagreed, who thought we should have a state church, who thought we should have some sort of endorsement of Christianity within the framework, if not a sort of state church, but like, the idea that we are a Christian nation. There's the sneaking of the words under God into the Pledge of Allegiance in the middle of the 20th century. There has been this like, authentic part of American history where sort of people who want to see it as a Christian nation have pushed that agenda and kind of written it into history. And it is there. I just think it's fair to say that if you look at history as sort of the winners and the broad strokes, like it's very clear that not being forced to be religious has been part of it for a long time, but so has the battle of the people who are like, no, 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 no. We need people to be religious or else we're doomed, right? Like we need like that's why everything's going to hell, is because people aren't religious enough, right? So I can't really on the one hand say that democracy is always kind of is part of the American story, but then also not say that like that fight for inserting Christianity and Christian nationalism into America is not part of that story, right? It definitely is. I think you're right, and I think you have the winning argument, right? But I still think it's an argument, and I still think
contested.
like facing that
It's
argument
been contested, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with the founding fathers in their intention and Jefferson, I think that you have to look at what they were trying to get away from, which was an established state church, like the Church of England.
Yeah.
And that if you were a religious minority, you had to have some kind of dispensation. If you were a Quaker,
Yes.
you had to fight for that right to be a Quaker.
Yeah.
And they were saying, well, you can be that if you want to be that. There's no established state church of America. And I say that's how it starts.
Yeah, but I also think you need to like look at the reasons why. I mean, first of all, like of course, sake of simplicity, like when we say founding fathers, right? It's a complicated term because so many of them just would have like beat the fuck out of each other if they're in the same room, right? There's so many differences of opinions among these people that we shouldn't flatten them. Although I understand the need to do that, and I do it all the time. I just think it's worth pointing out that like there's a great deal of difference of opinion among Adams and Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, etc. But yeah, I mean, having said that, I also think like it's important to understand that the reason primarily why they believed that, or why someone like Jefferson believed it, is because like they understood the fucking mess it had made in England, right? Like they understood that this kind of like official endorsement of religion leads not just to a monarchy, but also to like the idea of oppressed minorities who then start civil wars and like get on Mayflowers and stuff, right? And like come to this godforsaken place, right? Like that's that's also part of the thinking, is that they understood it as and I think this is an important thing to highlight to people, because I think we kind of forgotten this, is that they understood that a separation of church and state was essential to like national security and stability. In order to not have these kinds of like civil wars, right? And then we did anyway. And like you can look at the Civil War itself as a holy war, and like this huge religious element to the Civil War. And it's kind of a proof of concept, right? But like it had more to do with that, with like maintaining stability and not going down the path of installing what would effectively be another king. And again, that's why I think our current moment with Christian nationalism is so important, because that's exactly what, Christian nationalists want to do. It's exactly that.
Definitely getting back into the Christian nationalists, but I want to point out with the Heritage Foundation that they have been very instrumental on putting in some of these justices into the Supreme Court.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Mitch McConnell has been a big part of that. Back in, was it 2015 that they stonewalled on Obama, trying to replace one of them until, obviously until what turned out to be Trump would get in there. Yeah. So that has been, and like, even though Trump has been out of office, is like, we're still feeling the effects of that. And so they've definitely been able through the Supreme Court to fulfill their agenda for sure.
I mean, and then like you can draw a bunch of lines between like the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and the Heritage Society and Paul Weyrich, and like it's all part of the same kind of massive, sort of monster, right? And it's funny, like I was thinking about this too, because sometimes like what's so funny about 2025 is that like it is basically a conspiracy. Right? Like when
Yes.
you talk about conspiracies on the show, like this is an actual conspiracy of people like trying to do something.
And
to,
it's a master plan that's actually written down, which is
it's written
like,
down. And I think that when people think of like conspiracy theories, like they're thinking of basically think tanks, right? Like they're thinking of these like super educated Ivy League people like sitting in a room being like, how do we fuck up society this time? You know, and like it's so funny because it does exist, and these are the people who do it. They don't have the same kind of.
The left hasn't had something to latch onto like this that's just written out, this master plan written out so explicitly.
Nor would they, because the left by nature doesn't have plans. We just we have vibes. That's, you know.
It's funny you mentioned that because, you know, going down the whole 9/11 conspiracy rabbit hole, you encounter something called Project for a New American Century,
right?
Which is a think tank.
Yeah.
So it's funny that that you mentioned that like they basically do act in that same way. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are in it. I mean, I think the big thing for a lot of people, and I think that the way that the Democrats now are really spinning it is with some of the restrictions on abortion and defunding Planned Parenthood and these things. And like this is a way to really get women voters on the side of the Democrats. But this stuff is in there. It's not like this is something that is a propaganda piece by the Democrats. Like this is something that they definitely want to defund this. They definitely want, you see all this rhetoric about the Handmaid's Tale and all this. So let's talk a little bit about that, that aspect of Project 2025, because this is a big thing.
Yeah. So like, we talked about this kind of off mic, right? That one of the problems with communicating what's in it is that you can see a meme that it's like Project 2025 wants to like send, like allow 14-year-olds to go back to go to work, and like wants a national abortion ban, and it's, and wants to like outlaw gay marriage and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons why it's 922 or whatever it is, impenetrable, unreadable pages is that it gets really granular and sort of how it kind of puts these sort of ingredients together, so that when you like mix them in a pot, right, like what you end up with is all of those things. But the actual strategies of going about them, because like you can't, unless you just make Donald Trump a dictator, you can't, like on day one, you can't just say, which I know he wants to do, but like you can't just say abortion's illegal.
But only on day one.
Only on day one. You can't just say abortion's illegal now, right? You can't do that. So you can't, like, if the states have the rights to ban abortion, then you can't force every state to do it. You have to, put through Congress a national abortion ban. Right. So here's some actual language, like from the document itself, about how it talks about abortion. It says conservatives in the states and in Washington, including the next conservative administration, should push as hard as possible to protect the unborn in every jurisdiction in America. In particular, the next conservative president should work with Congress to enact the most robust protections for the unborn that Congress will support, while deploying existing federal powers to protect innocent life and vigorously complying with statutory bans on the federal funding of abortion. Right. So what it's saying is like in the meantime, use all the levers that you have within sort of the regulatory state and where you allocate federal funding to make abortion even less accessible than it is now, while you work to get through either by chipping away in like legislation, sort of one piece at a time, or just all out doing a national abortion ban. So does it say we want a national abortion ban? No. What it says is, like, let's do all the work to get there, and here are all the different paths we can take to get there. It's almost more devious than just being like coming out and saying it, right, on the surface.
Right. It's indirect instead of direct.
It's indirect by like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? like that sort of thing.
Yeah,
right?
but there's also language about defunding Planned Parenthood and these type of things.
Right. That's normal. That's normal, like mainstream Republican stuff at this point. Right. Like, that was like a a mantra during the Obama years when, the Tea Party Republicans took over and, John Boehner and all that sort of thing. Like defunding Planned Parenthood has like always been, and they, like only a certain percentage of their funding comes from the government anyway. A lot of it comes from independent donors and that sort of thing. But yeah, like that's a kind of that's a strategy, and that's kind of a like a dog whistle, right, to this sort of broader project. If you're saying ban Planned Parenthood or defund Planned Parenthood, you're saying something obvious, right? Like you're not being like, I don't like free pap smears, right? You're like, this is what you're talking about. It's clearly right. It's abortion. It's like it's dog whistle language. I mean, the same thing is true of like LGBTQ rights, right? So it doesn't actually say ban gay marriage, overturn or Obergefell, but like, clearly they would like that. But what it says is that, the federal government should subsidize, like biblically based family units, that sort of thing, right? Like encourage people to have children and be married to like one person, and they really, really are not fond of like no fault divorce because it's ruining the family. And so maybe we should not have that anymore. Right. That sort of thing. So when you put it all together, it's very clearly, right, an anti-LGBTQ agenda, right? It just doesn't have to like, it doesn't have to have a page where it's like, here's how we ban gay marriage forever. Right. Like it's, their opposition to Obergefell has been known for a long time. You don't need to like dig further to see if maybe that's something that they want.
So I think one of the most worrying aspects for a lot of people, myself included, is this idea of the absolute fealty of government employees. And we're not talking about people that each president will bring in his own people. There's, obviously like secretaries, they rotate. But you also have people in bureaucracy in federal government bureaucracy that are permanent employees. And this thing basically says that those people need to basically make some kind of oath of loyalty to the president and a particular president. And that if they don't, then they're going to get fired. And these people are, lifetime, probably 30 or 40-year people that, I mean, the Social Security Administration, I mean, how less political can you get?
Right.
I mean, this is stuff that I think is the most worrying, because you see that type of thing in dictatorships again and again. I mean, the bath party or something, for instance, everybody has to be in it. If you're, I mean, that was the reason why Iraq fell apart so quickly, because everybody that was just an ordinary bureaucracy, when they banned the bath party, well, all those people lost their jobs. So I mean, I think that's a good example of that. You're not necessarily, you're just some paper pusher, but you have to be in the party, essentially. And this is what this sets up, essentially.
No, I agree. To me, that is the most, that is the most alarming and the most plausible, right? Of all of the parts of the agenda. One of the things that, of course, like is a problem for the Heritage Foundation in this document is that like all of this stuff is deeply unpopular, right? Like if you like do a national abortion ban and like overturn Obergefell, like you are going to have riots in the streets. Like the people are like, this is going to be very, very, like it's not, people aren't going to stand for that, right? Or at least I would hope. So that's a harder thing to get, right? Like, but the dismantling of the civil service and the idea of like independent agencies and independent government workers no longer right existing in the United States, like that is a terrifying thing. And when we talked about the whole not a democracy or republic thing and this idea of like trial balloon language, one of the terms that really came to prominence in right-wing politics in 2016 is this idea of the deep state, right? Mm-hmm. And the deep state is meant to evoke a kind of like again, conspiracy theory, like cabal of the real people who really run the government, right? And that's almost a really great trick for them to pull off, because what they're actually talking about is something very real, and they're talking about the civil service. They're talking about non-political government employees, the bureaucrats who actually like make the post office run, and like, like make the VA run, and like that sort of thing, who work for the government, or like the FBI, right? Like who work for the government, but aren't political. And they have presented the idea that it's a problem that they're not political. It's a problem that they are not elected. It's a problem that they are not beholden to an elected official. That's what makes them the deep state. How can you trust them? How do you know they're not working against Donald Trump to undermine his presidency if if they're not elected and if they're not democratic? And it's a neat rhetorical trick, because at the one time you're presenting this idea of this, like, again, sort of conspiracy theory cabal, and on the other you're also talking about something very real, and that really is how America functions, like on a day-to-day basis. And so, yeah, I agree. Like the framework for just getting rid of agency independence is right there. It's really kind of easy to do, and once you do it, there's no going back. Once you do it, you can't just have like, oh well, I guess in 4 years we'll have another president who will like undo all of that stuff. Like, no, it's like breaking a glass bottle. You can't like unbreak it, right? It doesn't like that's a hard part, right? It's easy to break it, but it's not easy to reassemble. Yeah. And I really, it's such a boring, it's not a sexy, like, thing to warn people about, but it is the most urgent thing I think about this document.
Yeah, well, the conceptualization of the deep state really comes from critique of the national security establishment.
Sure.
Right.
And Peter Dale Scott, I believe, was the first person that
came up with that. Yeah.
I think a lot of that critique is very legitimate.
Sure. Sure.
But now it's like they're actually trying to create a deep state for the domestic civic bureaucracy. It's like they took that and they are actually trying to design that now in just our bureaucracies that we deal with in the government in everyday life.
Sergio and I have talked about this a lot, John, is that we've noticed that in a lot of these right-wing groups that when they talk about the left, and they talk about how the left operates, it's actually projection of them talking about how they operate.
Yeah.
And so what they really want to set up, they want in on the game. They want to set up their own, like Sergio said, they want to set up their own deep state. That's what they want. They want a loyal deep state. They don't want to get rid of a deep state. They want their own deep state.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this. I mean, you saw it again and again when Obama was president. I remember Dinesh D'Souza. One of his films, one of his documentaries. He was talking about the how basically talk about the deep state without using that word about Obama.
Yeah.
And it's like, and telling all these powers that he has. And when I was watching that in 2016, I'm like, well, wait a minute. So you're criticizing this power that's in the presidency, but what you want to do is you want to take that and you want to hand it to Donald Trump. That's essentially what he was doing. And there is this weird form of projection where, they act like, for instance, I remember there was a lot of chatter like 2015, because I was exposed to some of this right-wing talking points. They would talk a lot about Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals.
Oh God, the Saul Alinsky, like, yeah.
If you read Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, you'll see exactly how the left operates. But then the truth is, and there might be some truth to that, sure, but the truth is that they took those same things and they applied those lessons to what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. And again, like Heritage was founded on that very idea, right? That like the of kind of like projection of like Paul Weyrich, I think, overstated the effectiveness of the left, but like what he thought they were doing is like, we should just openly do that, right? Like what I'm accusing them of doing is what I should just set up an organization specifically to do. I think of like, one of the most important figures of 21st century politics, I think, is Karl Rove. And Karl Rove is someone who stealing elections was something he'd been doing since literally high school. Like one of his strategies for winning elections, especially close elections, was figuring out ways to like shave off votes on the margins and just like trick people into, into voting a certain way when it's going to come down to something. So, when we look at Florida 2000, that is the closest in modern history America's ever come to a stolen election. And the number of things that had to go right to make that work are enormous, right? The fact that you had, the one of the candidates' brothers running the state and the Secretary of State who runs the election, also a chair of that person's presidential campaign in that state, and the butterfly ballot and all of these elderly Jews voting for Pat Buchanan because of the way that this ballot was designed. And all of these things were like pretty clearly Florida, in a fair, real election would have gone to Al Gore, but it didn't. And there's this court battle and all that sort of thing. But the reason that I bring that up, and I think use the term projection is a good one, but I also think there's an element of it where it's not so much projection as preemptively accusing the other side of the thing that you're doing, right? Like in order to take that rhetoric away from them, to take the argument away from them. So at any point now, right, from this point forward, if a Democrat ever accuses the right of stealing an election, they're going to be like, well, that's what you said about us in 2020 and then January 6th and all that. What about all that? Right. I think Karl Rove really understood the value of that you just like, you do the thing that like kind of openly, so that when you get caught doing it, you can just be like, oh, that's what you said last time. Or like, you know what I mean? Like you're just a sore loser, etc. Right. Yeah, it's a very devious but effective strategy, right? Like it works really well. But I think like also a lot of it is like, there's that as kind of a conservative strategy that's existed for a long time in the US. And then there's also Donald Trump, who just like projection is just something he does like he's breathing. Like it's like he's just a kind of unique case where projecting things that he feels insecure about onto other people is just like second nature for him in this almost like psychotic kind of way. So you have a kind of both those things happening at the same time. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
I think with the Project 2025, this idea of this like basically loyalty, they want the loyalty from these employees, these lower level and mid-level employees, and the Supreme Court ruling of basically, the president has immunity.
Yeah.
It is
fine.
It's pretty scary to set that up.
Yeah.
But we've seen this for a long time. I think that really, you talk about the foundation of the republic. I mean, definitely the presidency was never meant to be as powerful as it is now. And it definitely is the most powerful. And that's been true for Democrats as well as Republican presidents.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think like you can look at the presidents who through, again, the course of history and the tides of history, right, kind of reset what the power of the presidency was. And I think, the big ones that stick out are Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, right? And then basically Ronald Reagan on, right? And the very nature of the job, right, has shifted, but also because like the country's become more powerful and the country is nuclear powered and the country after World War II, like its place in the world shifted as well. So like some of that's again kind of like natural. It's not, I don't think there's so much of sort of behind the scenes, like let's make, the presidency more imperial. But with this, I think you have something where it's like, no, let's actually do that. Like let's literally just turn it into an imperial.
Well, right? I mean, there's these ideas. I mean, the idea of unitary executive theory.
Yeah.
I mean, that is not new to like this Project 2025 idea. I mean, that has been going on at least for the last 25 years. I mean, they were doing that in the Bush White House.
Yeah.
Trying to say that the Bush administration can get away with certain things that, especially with things with dealing with like torture, because, you would have something like a unitary executive theory. And these different ideas that have floated, legal ideas and justifications that have floated around for a while now.
Yeah.
And those people, are probably coming back into power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those are the two main things that I really see. I mean, there's other things like, they want to do away with the Department of Education. That's
Right.
not new. These are
No.
ideas that have been around for a long time, but the justification for it is a little new, talking about like Common Core, or what was the God, it gets all mixed up in my mind, but
Common Core. There's a throwback to
right,
right wing
exactly, yeah,
panics from
like right,
2012.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
Race theory, critical race theory. That's what I
Oh
was
yeah.
thinking.
No, it's all been
CRT.
replaced with DEI. It's just the
DEI, this,
all-encompassing,
this is the
right?
latest thing now.
It covers Common Core. It covers CRT. It's perfect.
Critical race theory was so 2021, but
It really
um,
was.
you know, um, but all these things. I
Sharia
mean, it's just
law.
like
Yeah.
actually that the document even uses the word woke in it is
It's
funny.
so funny.
But
It's so
but
funny.
things
Depressing, but
like
it's funny.
doing away with the environmental or downsizing it, or
Yeah.
the National Oceanic and Administrative, all these things that, these have been things that have been kind of on the right wing shit list for a long time. So that's really not new,
Yeah.
these things, but it could, it could become policy.
Yeah, I think what's new is, as you correctly point out, the fact that the Supreme Court has just extremely elevated what the presidential powers are, that you can commit crimes as long as you're like, it's official, right? Whatever the hell that means. And that's going to be a mess for a long time to come until we expand the court and get rid of it. So I think there's that element of it, and that of course again, like getting the Supreme Court to be in that place where they make that decision has been a project of decades for the right to get to that point, right? So there's a reason why this moment is different, right? As far as like all of those priorities are concerned. There's always been like the pesky Congress in the way of doing stuff that has gotten in the way of like getting rid of the Department of Education, whatever, right? There's people saying no. There's people pushing back. There's institutionalists, right, who are part of these cabinets. And with Trump the first time around, and I think a lot of people have made this point, and I think it's really important to reiterate, right? Like he didn't know what he was doing. I mean, he doesn't know what he's doing anyway, but he didn't know what he was doing in terms of like staffing, in terms of bureaucracy. He knows now, and he also, the only people left who are going to work for him are these true believers. There aren't any. There's no normal bureaucratic people who are there to fill those jobs anymore, which is why like the guy who is most troubling to me in all of this is Russ Vought, right? And Russ Vought is an open Christian nationalist. He has worked in the Trump administration before. He is one of the architects of 2025, and he is very likely to be Donald Trump's chief of staff. He wants that job, and Donald Trump, if he says nice things to him, will give it to him, right? Like, we know that. They know they have a guy in Donald Trump who doesn't believe a damn thing. He has no ideology whatsoever, and he's going to do whatever people say, you're doing great, good job, let's do that, right? That sort of immediate reward sort of thing. It's the perfect scenario if, again, they can get him elected. But Russ Vought, right, being a chief of staff, like he is the guy, we talked about this off mic as well, but recently a group called the Center for Climate Policy, I think, who's this left-wing media organization in the UK, did a sting operation with him where they pretended to be somebody else, and they caught him on camera being like, oh yeah, whenever Donald Trump disavows us, he's just kidding. Like we talk all the time, and like he just is doing that for PR, right? And like, of course that's true. We all know that, right? But like, yeah, he is a very terrifying person, and someone who knows the ins and outs of like the executive branch, and really could get this stuff done. Like if he was running the show, yeah, the implications for that are pretty terrifying.
Yeah, it is. Democracy Now! Actually put something out about that. They played the whole like interview, the hidden camera and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I was telling
It's all
you
over
as
the internet.
well.
It's Kamala Harris's campaign tweeted it. It's in a new ad. Like it's all over the place now, but definitely watch the whole
Yeah.
thing. It is worth it.
And the thing is that Trump, when the media really picked up on Project 2025, even though it had been around for 2 years,
Yeah.
when they really picked up on it, Trump immediately really kind of disavowed it. Like, I don't know these people, even though a lot of those people were in the administration.
Like 80% of them.
And
Yeah. Like enormous numbers.
you could make an argument. You could say that, think tanks have come up with things before that don't necessarily become policy. You
Yep.
can make that argument. It's a 925 something page document, like we said before. Not everything may be implemented. But what really struck me in that hidden camera where they talked to this other guy, it wasn't Russell Vogt, it was somebody else.
It was Russell Vogt. That was him.
Well, there was another guy that said that basically when they were training, they were training people to help implement the Project 2025 agenda, that they weren't passing out or sending emails, that they were basically verbally telling these people what to do. So there really was no paper trail to avoid FOIA requests.
Yeah.
He told this reporter that, not knowing he was a reporter, but he told the reporter that.
Yeah.
To avoid FOIA requests.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these people are really sneaky.
They are
to do something like that.
Do you think they got a little overconfident in just putting this all out there and calling it by this nefarious sounding name, this project? And I mean, I don't know if they anticipated this kind of the blowback that they've gotten. I mean, they gave everybody on the opposition a title
roadmap.
Yeah.
All right. So to that point, I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought this up because people make that point a lot, right? It's so brazen. They're leaving the paper trail. They have this like massive document that like reveals their secret evil plan, right? It's like that scene in the terrible action movie where like the villain's like,
it's like their protocols of the learned elders of Zion.
So, what's up with that? So to me, and maybe this is my sort of doom-minded analysis of this, but to me is the most troubling thing, is that it is so public and is so brazen. And I think the reason why is because they've realized this is the time to strike and we're never going to get another chance at this. They know that if they get Donald Trump back into office, they really stand a very good chance of doing all of this stuff, right? Of like getting all of this wish list finally done. And one of the things I think that they've looked at in the last couple years since Dobbs has been a classic case of the dog catching the car, right? And like they don't know what to do because now they've taken away the thing that has been for the right for decades, right? The most reliable like vote turnout motivator, and given it to Democrats. And like my personal view of this race, even if Joe Biden had stayed in, I think that they would have lost. I think the Republicans would have lost, Trump would have lost, because at the end of the day, when people are like voting for the future of abortion, I think that was always going to turn the tide, right? I hope I'm still right about that. But I do feel like they're sort of in this position of like, well, shit, like we've overturned Roe. We've got the court now. This is the time. And we might as well just sort of like put it all out there and let people see it, because it probably would motivate that little tiny fringe of base voters that you need to have some red meat, some motivation for, to say, you're right, I gotta vote now, even if I hate Trump, like it's now or never. This is the exciting moment where my Christian nationalist vision is going to come to fruition. So to me, like everything about this approach, the publicness of it, right? The way that they're just sort of like, that Russell Vogt is saying out loud, even though he thinks it's not being recorded, right, is saying out loud, knowing that it possibly could be recorded and could make it public, that like, yeah, Donald Trump doesn't mean any of that stuff. He's going to do everything that we tell him to do. And it's totally cool. And we talk all the time. Perversely, I'm most worried that they're going to actually pull it off and do it for the reason that they've sort of dug themselves into a corner, right, with Dobbs, and they don't have any time left. It is like you move now or it's never going to happen, right? Like this is it. They know that if Kamala Harris wins the election and if Democrats win a majority in Congress and the Senate, it's over. Like they will turn Roe into a federal law, and that's over for them. And very likely like expand the court and start unwinding some of the stuff. And I think they see the reality of that, and that's why you should be worried. I don't want people to not be worried. This is going to happen or a lot of it is, if Trump's elected.
I think for that kind of the Christian nationalist evangelical base, that you're right. I mean, all the demographic bear this out, that white Americans are about to be a minority.
Right. Yes.
So when you add up all the other minorities together,
there's going to be a non-white majority.
Right.
Yes,
a non-white majority. Right. Not necessarily that each group is not a minority of themselves.
Right.
But the demographics in the next 20 years are going to start bearing this out. And so I think it just like in total, the idea that that this is going to happen and this is the point to pretty much to make this happen, to pretty much to strike on this. Mm-hmm. The Christian nationalist movement, even though like that's a term that I feel has just kind of come into vogue in the last couple of years, or maybe in the last year.
Yeah.
But it's been, we've talked about it, like it's been around a very, very long time. I've seen this stuff developing for a while. I mean, you guys talked a little bit about the one of the episodes, the New Apostolic Reformation and these things, and it's beginning to become this huge coalition of a lot of this kind of just like crazy extreme stuff that's happening.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that they are so panicked right now is that two things are happening at the same time, which is that the number of evangelicals in the country is diminishing. People are leaving the church in massive numbers, especially young people, and so they're facing an existential crisis. While at the same time, the entrenched power of dominionists and evangelicals in government is increasing. Right. And so there's this sort of, again, sort of like existential moment, this like panic button of like, the math doesn't look good for the future. The only option now is to sort of codify Christian evangelicalism as opposed to like the old fashioned way of just evangelizing to people. Right. Because we're losing in the pews. We have to win in the government. And that tension's always been part of sort of the dominionist, evangelical agenda. But now I feel like they really have their backs against the wall, and they're feeling that again, it's now or never, right? This is the moment to strike, because the future does not look good for their movement.
I think that this is potentially scary because you're seeing, especially since Biden dropped out and everybody, rallying around Harris, the Democrats rallying around Harris.
Yeah.
You're already seeing Trump with his rhetoric. He's already talking about, they're going to steal the election. He's already setting it up.
Yeah. And
I feel that if Trump loses, we could essentially see something like we talked about this before. Yeah. But we could essentially see some kind of like low-level insurgency in this country. I could see it very much happening.
Oh, I think it's inevitable. I don't think it's if. I think it's a how much. Yeah. Yeah. It's terrifying. It is. I've said before, like, as far as I'm concerned, Trump has to lose, but like him losing is also not a good situation. Like it's not like, hooray, we dodged a bullet. It's like, no, it's gonna be a lot of bullets, right? Like it's gonna be really fucking ugly. Because he knows that him losing is also him going to prison, right? And like that's a dangerous situation to be in. So I'm trying to be vibe happy right now, like I'm trying to like be walls pilled and all that sort of thing, but
I'm trying to have a little bit of fun before November.
Yeah, and I'm certainly like riding that wave, and like maybe it'll be such a blowout that he will be abandoned by his cult. I don't like, who knows, right? There's sort of marginal possibilities that he will lose so badly that even his most devout followers are like, well, the hell with this loser, let's go find a new one, right? Which is like the best case scenario, but I don't think it's likely. And yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is a scary prospect.
I wanted to ask you, this group of what we're calling Christian nationalists, they're obviously a minority who are dependent on creating these narratives, using mostly disaffected young men, mostly white men, but also black and Hispanics,
Hmm.
and creating this coalition. But it seems so fragile when you really talk about the possibility of implementing things that are going to curtail people's lifestyles. If the dog does catch the car, how's this really going to pan out? And how is this an attempted enforcement of any of this kind of stuff going to
Hmm.
not create just such a big backlash when it really starts to impede on people's personal lives and lifestyles and people that go beyond these minorities and the LGBT Q communities or even women. I
Yeah.
mean, it's because this vision is not what most non super traditional white men, even in this country, have for what the way they want to live their lives. I mean,
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so like one of the things that people have kind of like the analogy that's often used, kind of what you're talking about, is like how does the Project 2025's like, ban porn part
yeah,
play with bar
James Carville's been talking about this a lot. It's
yeah,
really
like with
thinks
the
it's a
Barstool Sports faction of MAGA, right?
yeah.
Like how does that work together? And the answer is really quite simple. It doesn't, right? Like the answer is, well, it turns out when you like side with the fascists, like they're going to turn on you, right? Like
Mhm.
like that's you can get them elected, but then like if they
Yeah.
decide to ban your thing and you get mad about it, like too bad we control the government now, and like I guess you're gonna have to go to prison or whatever it is, right? I don't think they care that the Barstool Sports MAGAs who get them
Yeah.
elected are going to like be thrown in prison for watching porn or something. Like I don't
That's
think
how
they
it
give
always happens in revolutions. That's how it always
exactly.
happens.
Yeah,
There's a broad coalition.
100%.
Then comes
You look at
elimination
something
of
like
internal opposition.
right. If you look at something like the Iranian, revolution. I mean, if you look at that, there were plenty of left wing and people that just wanted a democracy that so okay, we'll work with the Shia.
Yeah.
Well, they got theirs too, and like yeah, that's how it all. I liked what you said one time when you were like talking about how like, oh, the Protestants and the Catholics are working together, and you said, well, don't worry, once they're in power, they'll turn on each other, and
Absolutely.
this is how it always
Absolutely.
happens
Of
in
course.
revolution. Yeah,
Yeah, you get what you have to do to get to where you need to be, and then once you have the power, you don't care. And certainly like Donald Trump is not a person for whom like enduring loyalty has been one of his calling cards, you know what I mean? Like they know that he will turn on anybody as long as he likes you because you flatter him, right? So like, yeah, like warning to Barstool Sports guys, like, sorry, like this, they ain't for you. Like, if you want to keep watching porn, like, vote for Kamala Harris because like she's gonna like support sex workers and that sort of thing. But like it may not. You may have to like not own the libs as often as you do with memes, but like if that's the price you're willing to pay, then
Yeah.
that's yeah, I would give that some thought. Yeah, it's that whole classic like when I voted for the face-eating leopards, I never thought they'd eat my face. You know what I mean? It's
But even this like almost century old coalition of this free market fundamentalism with
yeah,
evangelicals, we're starting to see like ideological rips in and
sure. Yeah,
people
yeah,
realizing that this kind of capitalism that we have now doesn't really encourage families and family values and things like that. And like,
yeah.
let one breadwinner, male be, the head of a household and afford a home and all this kind of stuff. So I really see the possibility of a lot of realignments in the future. If when we come out the other side of this, not that that'll
Yes.
be necessarily better, but yeah, it's really odd.
No, I agree that realignments are inevitable, and I think possibly good. I mean, it's these kinds of things are never like it's going to be good or it's going to be bad. You can't predict that. I do think it's inevitable, and I think that it could be good. Like I think it could. There's bright sides and there's sort of positive trajectories that could be taken there. Our in this country, our sort of like left right understanding is so warped anyway that like we just we think of it so binary in terms of like the way that we have set up our political alignments that it doesn't really make any sense anymore. Like one of the things that people have been talking a lot about in this particular cycle is that Democrats are talking all about like veterans and freedom and like using these
chanting
ideas
USA
that Republicans have been running on forever, right? Like and they've abandoned and they've given to Democrats, right? And whether or not Republicans ever really supported actual freedom is beside the point. It was their brand. And, you know, when Lindsey Graham now goes on Fox News and says, I think republicanism is all about tolerance because we're just about leaving people alone. I'm like, nobody believes that anymore. Like that you can't, come on. In a post-Dobbs world, you cannot possibly say that with a straight face Lindsey Graham. And like nobody's buying it, but they absolutely would have in 2008, right? Like in the pre kind of Sarah Palin Republican Party. Absolutely. So like, yeah, I mean, I think the realignments are already kind of baked into the cake in some way, and there's gonna have to be some factional detachments that take place, and you know the emergence of like actually more than two parties, or at least some way of allowing kind of factions within parties to exist in a way that makes it slightly more parliamentary. I don't know how that's going to play out, but it does seem to be like we either lose democracy or we find a way of breaking it apart slightly so that we can function, right? And so that there's not an incentive to just like anytime, you know, when Democrats, you know, create a border bill that most liberals hate and most anybody left of center hates and is like put together mostly by James Lankford, who's really, really conservative, but then it gets sunk because Trump's like, no, don't do that. It's going to cost me the election. Like that can't hold, right? Like that has to change. You don't need to rewrite the entire sort of American system to make that change. And I think that will make people less conspiracy minded, honestly. Like I think one of the reasons why, you know, conspiracism has flourished so much in the last few years within the sort of political realm is because it's so easy to believe that a few people are kind of making all the decisions, right? Which again is what's just kind of so funny about 2025. Like there's like this is what baffles me, right? There's a version of this where the Heritage Foundation does not make this thing as public as they have, where they instead say, look at these lunatic left-wing idiots who think we're going to ban abortion and like ban gay marriage and everything else, like, and, you know, take over the entire bureaucracy. Like, what a bunch of raving lunatics. And they could have done that, right? And they could have just made this thing clandestine and had a few sort of left-wing journalists uncover it and then make it seem like some absurd fever dream. That's one strategy they could have taken. They could have taken the whole, like, the, you know, right-wing conspiracy QAnon thing and flipped it on its head and done this thing and made the left look stupid and made them look like conspiracy theorists until they actually did it. And the fact that they didn't, the fact that they're like, no, we're going to be bold and like outward with this again, is why I am so convinced that if they get the chance, they would actually do it. Because to me, again, it is a promise to those base voters who are like, I actually want a Christian nationalist society and I will turn out and this will give me another 0.8%, let's say, in Wisconsin, right? And like that might be enough to turn the tide of the election. I think that's what's happening there. But it's so mind-blowing to me that like this thing looks like a conspiracy theory unless they weren't so goddamn public about it. And it's just it's baffling, right? It's so funny.
A good point. Going back to like an earlier point, we kind of start winding it down, but just like an earlier point that you made that the Project 2025 people believe that they can tell Trump to do this, they can tell him to implement this, they can control him. This could go another way completely. I mean, the German nationalists in 1933 brought Hitler into government because they thought that they could control him. That if we bring him into government, we will be able to control him in the Nazi party. Well, that's not what happened. So I mean, I look at Trump as like I look at Trump as like very cynical, like Putin.
Yeah.
It's like the same way. I mean, Putin is more
Mhm.
cynical, but
Yeah.
Trump is cynical. And, if it does not fit what he likes or what he cares
Yeah.
about, he'll turn against,
He
he
needs
could
them right
easily turn
now,
against.
but that doesn't mean.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all about power and who wields power. I mean, Stalin did the same thing. He played the left and the right and the center all against each other until he was the only one standing. I mean,
Yeah.
these are things that happen constantly through history. But I did want to ask you, and kind of the last thing about JD Vance. Uh,
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
taking the whole
Does he
weird thing
wear
out of the
does he
equation
wear
and
Is
eyeliner?
the couch thing true? Yes, it
and
is.
the couch thing and all that. But just
Yeah.
like, this is something that this is a whole other aspect. JD Vance, I think, well, yes, he's a Christian nationalist, but
Yeah.
who is this guy? Where did he
Ah,
come from? Yeah, he wrote Hillbilly Elegy and all this. Great. He was against Trump until he was for, but but what he really represents and where he really comes from
yeah.
is Peter Thiel
Yeah.
directly and probably indirectly Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And this, you talk about the Barstool Sports guys, these are the tech bro guys
Yeah.
that are behind JD Vance.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Broad coalition, I suppose.
Peter Thiel, who is gay,
Right,
right? Like,
right,
um,
right.
and also a Nazi. Wants to drink blood.
Ernst Röhm was gay and a Nazi too, so it
Yeah.
works. It happens.
Right. Again, face eating leopards, as long as they don't eat my face. If you'd asked me a year ago who JD Vance is, I would have had a good answer for you, and I don't anymore. I do have some theories, right? Like in sort of descending order. And number one is like a cynical, power motivated prick. Like, is sort of, do I believe he's really a Christian nationalist? No, not really. Do I believe I think he is more in kind of the trad calf
Mhm.
mold, and I think that's sort of an emerging
Yeah,
side of him.
yeah. In
Um,
fact, through the influence of Peter Thiel.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
He's
Um,
he's definitely that's he's come to that through Peter Thiel. Yeah.
I think he's a vulnerable, sad little boy, who had kind of a shitty childhood, and then also like got to go to Yale and is like pretty smart, but not very like adept to humans, and like interaction.
Mhm.
So, like I don't take anything Trump says seriously. I just know that as soon as someone flatters him and tells him he's great and is doing a great job and is very powerful, that he will let them do whatever they want. So that's what I'm worried about as far as that goes. With JD Vance, I'm a little bit more. Um, JD Vance is slightly more of kind of like he has an ideology. I just think he's willing to kind of sell it out whenever it sort of fits his immediate goals. What I think JD Vance wants is to like be president, um, funnel a shitload of money to very, very rich people because he believes, I think, in this sort of like techno utopia, Silicon Valley dream, right? All
Yeah.
while kind of forcing upon America this sort of like ideal Leave It to Beaver nuclear family that he never had growing up as a kid because he is like dealing with a bunch of unresolved trauma. That's who I think JD Vance is. I also think JD Vance is an enormous gift to the Democratic Party. I think JD Vance is one of the least talented politicians I've ever seen in my entire life. I have no idea. I mean, the JD Vance's success comes from like flagellating liberals who were like, "Oh, he wrote this really nice book about
Yeah.
how like not, like how I learned about people living in the country." And like
I
that's
understand why Trump won.
yeah, who are like, "Yeah, I gotta understand why he won. It's the, legitimate economic anxieties and all of that bullshit." Everybody I know who read Hillbilly Elegy is like a nervous liberal. And is like, "Oh no, it's interesting." And it's like, "No, it's fucking not. It's really bad." But that's, he's sort of like a sad little fail son who Yeah, I think he has some dangerous ideas, and I think he will do anything for power. I think if you really nail him down on what his ideology, he's basically just like Paul Ryan. Like, I don't think he's not really that. He's pretty mainstream. Like he called Trump a Nazi or Hitler and didn't vote for him. Like, that's who he is behind closed doors. But like, yeah, he's an opportunist. He's willing to kind of sell anybody out and anything out to kind of get his own way. But I also don't think he has a real future in politics because he sucks at it. And like, that's great.
I have a different viewpoint on him.
Okay, go ahead.
And it's probably even worse. Is that my viewpoint is that like you're not going to see the last of this guy. I have always said, Sergio and I have talked about this a lot. I've always said that, Trump is boisterous and he's a buffoon and he's a clown. He is.
Yeah.
He's in many different ways. When you have somebody that is slick and plain spoken and is in some ways nondescript, that's the guy to watch out for.
Mm.
And that is, I think, he's like Ron DeSantis, I think is more typifies that than
But he sucks at politics too.
But I think but I mean he runs that state like it's like a dictatorship.
Yeah. Well, he's great for Florida. It's
but it's just like the guy that is the background type of guy, that is just like, not necessarily charismatic in some ways, can be when he needs to be, but is like in some ways like a Viktor Orban type character.
Yes.
Not that is an administrator. That's I think the guy that you got to look out for. Putin is that.
If you could get that
That is
far.
Putin. That's Putin.
Yeah.
Because
No,
Putin
you're right.
Came through the ranks. And
maybe maybe you're saying that he's the most dangerous as a part of the Trump administration.
Oh, for sure.
May not be like a great future presidential candidate, but he can be, Trump's Himmler, maybe.
Well, I'm saying that if
for the future,
if Trump loses for the future
of MAGA,
like he's 39 years old. Give him 10 years. I mean, there's no telling.
Maybe he can buy a personality.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me make this point because and again, I know that we should throw all sort of political common wisdom out the window at this point, right? But there is no surer indicator of the death of someone's political career than being the losing vice presidential candidate. Like, look at what happened to Paul Ryan, right? Like, look at all of the losing VP candidates, and their career dies. It is an absolute kiss of death for a political career. I don't think he is. I would have agreed with you if he had not been picked for VP and become so public so quickly and been so disliked so historically, right? As he is right now. I think he has shot all chances of him being the future of MAGA to hell by being the VP, which I was shocked by the way. I can't believe Trump picks someone so bad, a guy who locks up the white male vote for you. Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm sorry. Like, I hope you lose. Yeah,
when he picked JD Vance, I felt the same way. Felt like, what? I mean, it's odd.
Who is this for?
But when you realize, I really think it was that tech bro contingent. I think it was Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. I think.
Oh, and his arrogance that he was definitely going to win because it was going to be a landslide, so he could just have whoever he wanted, right? And there is that. No, I don't think it is JD Vance, but I do think you've put your finger on if there is an heir to MAGA, what that kind of person will be, right? And I do think the way that the media portrayed JD Vance, the person who they told us he was, I don't think he really is, right? The sort of like well-spoken guy who can articulate MAGA positions, but in a way that doesn't sound insane. I do think that's, if they can find that person, I do think that is the person who takes over once Trump exits stage right. But I don't think it's JD Vance.
That's the person.
I just don't think it's
him. That's the person you got to look out for, I think.
100%. Yeah.
Well, John, this has been a great conversation, man. I've really enjoyed this. We've covered a lot of ground, and some of it has been really kind of scary and concerning. But Please tell people where they can find Pod Only Knows, and it also is a continuation of another podcast as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know Kelly wanted to be here. The reason that she's not here is that she has a master's degree and a doctorate already, but has decided it would be cool to get another master's degree. So that's what she's doing right now.
Because why not?
So her schedule is pretty tight, but hopefully we can both come back at some point in the future. It'd be a lot of fun. So we every other Tuesday, you can find Pod Only Knows on anywhere that you find podcasts. I don't think there is a platform that we're not on. You can email us at pok@cageclub.me if you want to chat and say hi or have questions or whatever else. We often talk about really depressing shit like this, but we try to have fun doing it. So we try and talk about depressing stuff with a laugh. If you happen to be in the San Diego area in November, we are also going to be presenting on a panel at the American Academy of Religion conference in San Diego. About religion podcasting. So if you have any San Diego listeners who are interested in coming, the tickets are not entirely cheap, but we are presenting on Monday morning. So if you just want to go for that one day, that's not as expensive. And it'd be really fun to have as many people there as possible. So yeah.
If we're going to become a theocracy, you might want to learn about religion. And
yes, and especially this will be after the election. So I have no idea what mood we're going to be in or what kind of stuff we're going to be talking about, but we'll be there. Brad Onishi from Straight White American Jesus is going to be there, a bunch of other people. So we'll either be talking about how we dodged the bullet of a theocracy or how the hell we're going to navigate the bullets of theocracy. Hopefully the first one, but we'll see when the future happens, I guess.
Or before the election, before we descend into a theocracy in the beginning of November, there is the Strange Realities Conference.
One last party.
One last party before it's illegal or something.
Yeah.
So Strange Realities Conference coming up, Nashville, Tennessee, November 1st and through the 3rd, November 1st and 2nd at SIR Nashville, and November 3rd online as well. The whole thing is online. So I don't think it's just that one day. But so tickets are available. Come get them. Come join us either in Nashville or virtually. And we also have our Patreon if you would like to support us in what we do.
And that can be found at patreon.com/Conspirinormal. But really encourage anyone who can come out to Strange Realities in person. It may be the last chance to do so for some time. Maybe the last Strange Realities conference that does not need to be approved by the Ministry of Culture. So coming out November 1st.
The Ministry of Paranormal Culture. All right, John, thank you so much for joining us. And
guys, it's great. Good to see you.
Tim and all will be joining us next week. So to kind of officially kick off our countdown to Strange Realities. So join us next week on Conspirinormal.